Imagine a palace with hundreds of rooms. In each one a woman waits, some for months, others for years. They wait to be called by a name the king may not even remember. They wait for a night that may never come. And when it does come, it lasts hours. Then silence returns. That was the life of a concubine in the Old Testament. And to understand that reality, you need to abandon everything the modern world has taught you about relationships, dignity, and choice. Because in the ancient world, none of those concepts applied to these women. They existed in a space between wife and slave, between privilege and invisibility, between the master's bed and the oblivion of the records. They were not free. They were not completely imprisoned. They were something that modern vocabulary simply cannot define with precision. The Hebrew term is pilegesh. It appears more than 30 times in the biblical text, and every time it appears, it carries a weight that simple translation cannot convey. A pilegesh was not a casual lover. She was not a prostitute. She was not a girlfriend. She was a woman legally bound to a man, with defined sexual and reproductive obligations, but without the rights that a wife possessed, without a formal marriage contract, without a dowry negotiated between families, without the protections that marriage offered within Mosaic law. In practical terms, she was a second-class wife with first-class duties, and that changes everything in the way you read dozens of Old Testament passages. It begins with Abraham, the patriarch who received the promise of descendants more numerous than the stars in the sky, had a wife named Sarah. But Sarah could not conceive. And in the ancient world, female infertility was not merely a medical issue. It was a matter of honor, legacy, and family survival. A woman without children was a woman without recognized social function. And a man without heirs was a man without a future, without a name to perpetuate, without arms to work the land God had promised. So Sarah made a decision that by the standards of the time was perfectly logical. In Genesis 16, she gave her Egyptian servant Hagar to her own husband. The text is direct. Sarah said, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Take my servant. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Notice the language. Sarah did not ask Hagar if she agreed. There was no consultation, there was no conversation, there was no consent. Hagar was handed over, like a resource, like a reproductive tool with a name and a face, but without a voice. And Abraham accepted. The text of Genesis 16, verse 4, simply records, "He slept with Hagar, and she conceived." 3 sentences, no romanticism, no emotional context, and that woman's life changed forever. But the pregnancy did not bring relief. It brought conflict. Hagar, upon realizing she carried the heir that Sarah could not produce, began to look at her mistress with contempt. It was a human reaction. The servant no one had consulted now had something the mistress did not possess. And Sarah, wounded in her pride, responded with brutality. The biblical text uses a Hebrew word that indicates severe oppression, systematic humiliation. Sarah mistreated Hagar to the point of making her flee into the desert, pregnant, alone, without water, without a destination, without a map. An Egyptian woman in the middle of a land that was not hers, fleeing a house where she never had a choice about staying or leaving. This is the rawest portrait of what it meant to be a concubine in the ancient world. You did not choose to enter. You did not choose to leave. You did not choose when, how, or with whom. Your body belonged to whoever bought you, received you as a gift, or took you as spoils of war. And when the situation became unbearable, flight was the only recourse. But fleeing meant facing the desert, predators, hunger, thirst, and almost certain death. Most did not survive. Hagar only survived because, according to the text, the angel of the Lord found her by a spring in the desert and told her to return. returned to the same house, to the same mistress, to the same system. Hagar returned. She bore Ishmael. She raised the boy for more than 13 years within that family structure. And then, when Sarah finally had Isaac through divine intervention, Hagar and her son were definitively expelled. Genesis 21 records, Abraham rising early in the morning, taking bread and a skin of water and placing them on Hagar's back along with the boy. Bread and water. After more than 15 years of serving that family, after bearing Abraham's first son, after years of service, humiliation, and obedience, that was the final settlement: bread, water, and the desert. But Hagar was not the only one. After Sarah's death, Abraham took another woman named Keturah. The text of Genesis 25 identifies her as a wife. But 1 Chronicles chapter 1, verse 32 calls her a concubine. This ambiguity is revealing. It shows that the boundary between wife and concubine was fluid, negotiable, and depended more on social context and the convenience of the moment than on a rigid legal definition. Keturah bore 6 sons for Abraham. 6. But when it came to inheritance, the text is surgical. Abraham gave everything to Isaac. To the sons of the concubines, he gave gifts and sent them away, to the east, far from the son of the promise. Gifts and distance. That was the departure package for those born on the wrong side of the marital hierarchy. Now multiply that pattern across centuries and an entire civilization. Jacob, Abraham's grandson, had 4 women, 2 formal wives, Leah and Rachel, and 2 concubines, Bilhah and Zilpah. The concubines were servants of the wives. They were given to Jacob exactly as Hagar had been given to Abraham. For the same reason, with the same logic, and with the same total absence of consent. Bilhah was Rachel's servant. Zilpah was Leah's servant. When the 2 wives competed over who would give Jacob more sons, the servants became the battlefield of that rivalry. Genesis 30 records Rachel saying, "Here is Bilhah, my servant. Sleep with her, so that she may give birth on my knees, and I too may have children through her." Each son born to a concubine was counted as the child of the wife who had given her. The concubine's body was the instrument. The credit went to another woman. Bilhah bore Dan and Naphtali. Zilpah bore Gad and Asher. 4 of the 12 tribes of Israel were born of concubines. 4 entire tribes with demarcated territories, organized armies, designated priests, and lineage extending across millennia had their origin in women the biblical text mentions almost in passing, without attributed speeches, without recorded feelings, without even the description of a face or the mention of a personal preference. They bore nations and remained anonymous within the very history they helped build. And the situation of these women did not improve over time, it worsened. Because as Israel evolved from a nomadic clan to a tribal confederation and then to an established monarchy, the number of concubines per leader exploded. The book of Judges, chapter 8, verse 30, records that Gideon had 70 sons, for he had many wives. And beyond those wives, he maintained a concubine in Shechem who bore him Abimelech. A concubine's son who, driven by ambition and resentment over his own origins, massacred 69 of his own brothers to seize power. The blood spilled because of disputes between sons of wives and sons of concubines could fill entire volumes of Israel's history. But the most brutal case involving a concubine is in Judges 19, and it is one of the most disturbing texts in all of the Bible. A Levite who lived in the hill country of Ephraim had a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. She left him and returned to her father's house. The Hebrew text uses an expression that can mean she prostituted herself against him, or, in other manuscript traditions, that she became angry with him and left. The ambiguity of the translation already reveals the complexity of the situation. But the Levite went to get her. He traveled to Bethlehem. He stayed for days at his father-in-law's house, eating and drinking. And when he finally departed with the concubine, already at dusk, he decided to spend the night in the city of Gibeah, territory of the tribe of Benjamin, rather than seek shelter in a foreign city. What happened that night became one of the darkest episodes in the biblical record. Men of the city surrounded the house where the Levite was staying. They demanded that the host hand over the visitor so they could abuse him. The host, an elder of the city, refused to hand over the Levite. But he offered two alternatives, his own virgin daughter and the Levite's concubine. The text of Judges 19, verse 25, records the outcome. Then the man took his concubine and sent her outside to them. He handed her over. The woman was raped throughout the entire night by that group of men. The text does not economize on describing the duration, from nightfall until dawn. When day broke, she dragged herself to the door of the house where the Levite was sleeping peacefully and collapsed there, with her hands stretched out on the threshold. The Levite opened the door in the morning, saw the woman lying on the ground, and said 5 words that reveal the complete dehumanization of the system. "Get up, let us be going." She did not answer. She was dead. And the Levite's reaction was not grief, not horror, not guilt. It was political calculation. He placed the body on the donkey, took it home, picked up a knife, and cut the corpse into 12 pieces. He sent 1 piece to each tribe of Israel as a protest, as a summons to war, as a bloody pamphlet. The mutilated body of a nameless concubine became military mail. This episode triggered a civil war that nearly exterminated the tribe of Benjamin entirely. In the battles described in Judges 20, more than 65,000 combatants died on both sides. Entire cities were burned. Entire families were decimated. And it all began with the body of a woman whose own companion handed her over to be raped because he did not want to risk his own physical safety. At no point in the account does anyone ask her name. The text identifies her only as the Levite's concubine. She was born without a name in the records, lived without a name in the records, died without a name in the records. And her body was used as a political instrument even after death. That is the dimension of what it meant to occupy that position in the social hierarchy of ancient Israel. The concubine was not the owner of her own body in life, and not even in death did she have autonomy. With the arrival of the monarchy, the system did not merely continue, it became institutionalized. It gained administrative, logistical and protocolar structure. Saul, the first king of Israel, had at least 1 concubine recorded in the texts, Rizpah, daughter of Aiah. And when Saul died in battle on Mount Gilboa, the possession of Rizpah automatically became a political dispute. In 2 Samuel chapter 3, Ishbosheth, Saul's surviving son, accused Abner, the powerful army commander, of having slept with Rizpah. The accusation was not about morality or jealousy, it was about pure power. In the ancient world of the Middle East, taking the concubine of a dead king was a formal act of claiming the throne. Sleeping with the king's woman symbolically equaled sitting on the king's throne. The concubine's body was political territory. Whoever controlled it demonstrated legitimacy before the people. This same logic appears even more explicitly with David. When Absalom, David's own son, rebelled against his father and took Jerusalem in one of the most dramatic reversals in Israelite history, the counselor Ahithophel gave a brutally strategic piece of advice recorded in 2 Samuel 16, verse 21. "Sleep with your father's concubines, whom he left to take care of the palace. Then all Israel will hear that you have made yourself obnoxious to your father, and the hands of everyone with you will be strengthened." The act was deliberately public. Absalom had a tent pitched on the roof of the royal palace, in full view of the entire city, and slept with the 10 concubines David had left behind, 10 women, used as a public declaration of war against the aggressor's own father. When David recovered the throne after Absalom's death, The text of 2 Samuel 20 verse 3 records without emotion the final fate of those 10 women. David took them back and placed them in a house under permanent surveillance. He provided material support, but he never slept with any of them again. They lived the rest of their days as widows of a living husband, locked away, sustained, and absolutely forgotten until the day of their death. They were not punished for having committed any crime. They were punished for having been used by another man, contaminated in the eyes of the system, discarded with the same bureaucratic efficiency with which they had been acquired years before. And David, with all the complexity of his history, was not the exception in the scale of the system. He was the norm for monarchs of the ancient East. The text of 2 Samuel 5, verse 13, records that David took more concubines and wives when he established himself in Jerusalem. It does not specify how many, it only records that there were many, and his son Solomon elevated the system to a scale that defies modern comprehension. 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 3, records the numbers 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines. 300 concubines in a single palace. Consider what that represented in daily practice. 300 women needed individual or shared quarters, daily food, clothing adequate to the royal standard, personal servants for each group, specialized medical care for pregnancies and childbirths, and constant surveillance to prevent unauthorized contacts. Solomon's harem was not an intimate space. It was a large-scale administrative operation that rivaled in complexity the management of a mid-sized city. Documents from contemporary civilizations such as Assyria and Babylon describe similar structures with extremely rigid internal hierarchies. There were first-tier concubines who had more frequent access to the king and received privileged treatment. Second-tier concubines called occasionally for events or specific nights. And third-tier concubines who could spend years or their entire lives within the harem complex without ever being called. Fed, clothed, watched, and completely forgotten by the man who theoretically owned them. Daily life within these structures was not the romanticized setting that centuries of literature and art constructed. It was a monitored, monotonous, and suffocating routine. The women were permanently supervised by eunuchs, men surgically castrated who functioned as guardians, administrators, and intermediaries. Castration was a dynastic security measure. It ensured that no guardian could compromise the purity of the royal lineage. The Book of Esther, although portraying a Persian rather than Israelite context, describes dynamics that applied to a greater or lesser degree throughout the entire ancient Eastern region. The women destined for the king went through up to 12 months of preparatory treatments, 6 months with oil of myrrh, 6 months with perfumes, ointments, and specific cosmetics, an entire year of intensive aesthetic preparation for a single night with the monarch. And after that night, if the king did not show special interest, the woman was transferred to the house of the concubines. She did not return to the royal presence unless specifically called by name. If the king did not remember her, she simply remained there, materially sustained but personally ignored. Young, but without her own future. Alive in biological terms, but without an autonomous life in any meaningful sense of the word. The matter of children made the dynamic even more complex and dangerous. A concubine who bore a male child acquired a layer of social protection that the others did not possess. The son was recognized as a legitimate descendant of the father, although with a status inferior to that of sons born to formal wives. But this partial recognition functioned as a sharpened, double-edged sword, because sons of concubines represented potential rivals in succession disputes. And when those disputes intensified, especially upon the death of a king, the first targets for elimination were precisely those sons of ambiguous status. And when the sons were eliminated, The mothers lost the only protection the system granted them and the only reason they were kept alive and sustained. Abimelech, the son the concubine of Gideon bore in Shechem, massacred 69 of his brothers on a single stone to consolidate power. Jephthah, identified in Judges 11 as the son of a prostitute or concubine, was expelled from his father's house by the legitimate sons of Gilead before becoming one of the most controversial judges of Israel. The dynamic repeated itself generation after generation. The concubine's son carried the father's blood in his veins, but did not carry the social legitimacy that opened doors. He needed to conquer by force, cunning, or divine providence what other sons received simply by birthright and by the status of their mother. Concubines also functioned as diplomatic currency between kingdoms. Kings sent women to other kings as living seals of military and commercial alliances. They received foreign women as tangible guarantees of peace and non-aggression agreements. Solomon's monumental harem, with its 700 foreign princesses and 300 concubines, was not the personal excess of an indulgent monarch. It was foreign policy systematically materialized in female bodies. Each woman who entered that complex represented a signed treaty. Each pregnancy represented a blood bond between potentially hostile nations. And when an alliance dissolved, the woman who physically represented it became a diplomatic problem to be resolved or simply discarded. Archaeological records from contemporary neighboring civilizations confirm this practice on a massive scale with detailed documentation. Cuneiform tablets found in the ruins of Ugarit, dated to approximately 1400 years before the Common Era, describe transactions involving concubines with the same bureaucratic and commercial language used to record trade in cattle, grain, and precious metals. Specific contracts detailed the agreed price for the woman, the buyer's food and clothing obligations, and the conditions of return in case of proven infertility. The biological inability to bear children was formally listed as a contractual termination clause, like a defect in an acquired product. But how was it possible that such a system could keep functioning for centuries within a culture that claimed to serve a just God? In legal terms, Mosaic legislation attempted to establish minimum protections within a system that had already existed culturally for centuries. Exodus 21, verses 7 through 11, specifically regulated the situation of an Israelite servant sold by her own father as a concubine. If the master designated her for his own son, he was to treat her with the rights of a daughter. If he took another woman in addition to her, he could not reduce the food, clothing, or conjugal rights of the first. And if he failed to fulfill any one of those three obligations, the woman would have the right to leave without paying anything at all. Deuteronomy 21, verses 10 through 14, regulated the specific situation of women captured in wars. The Israelite soldier who desired a foreign captive was to bring her home, completely shave her head, trim her nails, change her foreign clothes, and grant her 30 full days to mourn her father and mother. 30 days of recognized mourning before anything could happen. Only after that period could the man take her as a wife. And if afterward he no longer wanted her, he was obligated to set her free. He could not sell her as a slave or treat her as merchandise because he had already humiliated her, according to the expression of the text itself. These laws, however insufficient they may seem by contemporary standards, represented an unprecedented attempt in the region to humanize a system that in neighboring civilizations operated without any restriction whatsoever. In Assyria, an owner could kill his concubine without facing any documented legal consequence. In Babylon, sons of concubines were only recognized as part of the family if the father made a formal public declaration before specific witnesses. The Mosaic Code, within its particular historical context, offered concrete protections that no other legal system in the region provided. But protection is not freedom. Regulation is not equality. And humanizing a brutal system does not transform it into a just one. What is striking about the biblical texts is that, despite recording the system without condemning it with explicit declarations, the narrative never romanticizes the condition of these women. Hagar suffers, and the text records that God sees her and hears her in the desert. Bilhah and Zilpah are used as reproductive instruments, and their sons permanently carry the social marks of their origin. The Levite's concubine in Judges 19 is brutalized to death, and the text records every detail of the violence without sparing the reader any horror. David's 10 concubines are used as weapons of political war, and then locked away until they died in isolation. The biblical record is consistently raw, factual, and without any beautifying filter. The later prophets of Israel began using the imagery of concubinage and marital infidelity as a powerful metaphor to describe the broken relationship between God and the people. Hosea received the divine command to take an adulterous woman as his wife, dramatizing in his own life how Israel had become unfaithful to the God who had rescued it from Egypt. Ezekiel, in chapters 16 and 23, employs explicit language of prostitution and sexual infidelity to describe the political alliances that Israel and Judah were forming with pagan nations. The metaphor worked with devastating force because the original audience understood viscerally, in their own flesh and in the experience of the women around them, what it meant to be used and then discarded when convenience ran out. But the quietest story, and perhaps the most powerful one of resistance, is that of Rizpah, the concubine of Saul. After Saul died and David consolidated the throne over all Israel, a severe famine struck the land for 3 consecutive years. David inquired of the Lord and received the answer that the famine was a consequence of a massacre Saul had perpetrated against the Gibeonites, violating an ancient oath. To make reparation, David negotiated with the Gibeonites and handed over 7 of Saul's descendants for public execution. 2 of those 7 executed men were direct sons of Rizpah, the concubine. What Rizpah did after that execution remains one of the most impressive acts of quiet courage recorded in all of the Bible. 2 Samuel 21 verse 10 describes, Rizpah spread a sackcloth on the rock where the bodies were left exposed and remained there vigilant from the beginning of the barley harvest until rain fell from the sky upon the bodies. It was weeks, possibly months. Day after day, she drove away the birds of prey that descended to devour the flesh of the dead. Night after night, she chased off the wild animals that approached, drawn by the smell of decomposition. Alone, without weapons other than her own presence, without an army, without allies, without anyone. Rizpah had no political power. She commanded no soldiers. She had no voice in any council. She was an aged concubine whose 2 sons had been executed as currency of diplomatic reparation between a living king and a people offended by a dead king. And all she could do was watch over the bodies, refuse to let them be devoured, insist, with her own physical presence under sun and rain, that those dead men still deserved dignity. And that silent vigil, sustained by a woman the entire system had discarded, was so powerful that the news reached the ears of King David. And David, moved by the act of that solitary concubine, finally ordered that the remains of Saul and Jonathan be recovered from Jabesh Gilead and buried with dignity in the land of Benjamin, along with the 7 who had been executed. A concubine, with nothing but her own stubborn presence and the refusal to abandon her dead, forced a king to act with dignity. Historians estimate that for every concubine mentioned by name or by function in the Bible, hundreds lived and died without anyone recording even the day of their birth. The sacred text preserved fragments, clippings, flashes of entire lives compressed into 2 or 3 verses. The rest was lost with the desert wind, with the dust of centuries, with the silence of those who were never given permission to tell their own story. But what was recorded is already enough to understand the real dimension of what happened behind the scenes of royal palaces and patriarchal tents. Behind every political alliance celebrated, every territorial expansion conquered, every dynasty consolidated over blood and oaths, there were women whose only recognized power was to bring life into being for men who completely controlled their lives. History usually remembers those who conquer. It rarely remembers those who were conquered. These women were both at the same time, and that is why their stories still disturb us.